Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Blitz panel convened by the Review of Democracy at the Central European University Democracy Institute. We aim to provide a rapid yet informed analysis of the results of the Brazilian elections that took place yesterday on the 2nd of October. Former President Lula da Silva obtained 48.4% of the votes, while currently serving President Jair Bolsonaro received 43.2% of the votes. The 5% difference translates into 5 million vote difference cast in the for the presidency. As no candidate reached a 50% benchmark, yesterday's vote will be followed by a second round for electing the president at the end of October. I have three fantastic panelists with me who will provide background and insight into the results and a good sense of the road ahead. Special thanks are to Professor Cláudio Couto, who is an adjunct professor at the Department of Public Management at FGV in Sao Paulo. He is an occasional columnist for Valor Econômico and for Estado Sao Paulo, and also a policy columnist for the Brazilian Report. A very warm welcome to Juliana Cesario, who is joining CEU's Legal Studies Department as a visiting professor. Her background is in human rights theory and constitutional law, on constitutionalism in Americas, on gender and sexuality and social mobilization. Juliana, before joining CEU, was a professor of human rights at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and she also has been a fellow at FGV in Rio de Janeiro and a visiting fellow at Yale Law School. And last but not least, our very own Thiago Amparo, who is currently in New York with a prestigious fellowship at NYU. And in his normal time, he is a professor at FGV Sao Paulo, where he teaches law and international relations, focusing on human rights, international law, diversity, and discrimination. Among his many prestigious appointments, Thiago is a weekly columnist for the Folha de Sao Paulo. My name is Renata Uitz. I'm a co-director of the Democracy Institute and teach comparative constitutional law at CEU Legal Studies. So let me turn to the panel and ask the first question. Could you please canvass a little bit the background of Brazilian election rules? Yesterday's elections were not only for the presidency, but also a number of other posts. It would be really important to have a sense of what voters were casting their votes for and what the options were. Maybe if I could turn to Claudio at this point.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, especially for Thiago, who keep in touch with me yesterday to make this invitation. Yesterday or the day before, perhaps. I don't remember right now. So many things happening these 3 last days. Well, Brazilian elections, they are somewhat comprehensive every 4 years. We are talking not only about the presidency, as you said, but we are talking also, Renata, about elections for the Congress, what means the Senate and the House. In this year, Brazilians elected 1/3 of the senators. Some years we elect 2/3, and so this is the year in which we have just 1/3 changed. And also we have the elections of the House and the state assemblies and the governors in Brazil. And so it's a very big election. It's a very large election. And what we had yesterday, first we had a surprise. And this surprise has to do with the fact that Bolsonaro, that appeared something like 10 points behind Lula in the majority of the polls, and even considering the more traditional companies that make polls, well, he finished this race only 5 points behind Lula. And so this is a huge surprise considering what many people were expecting. It's curious that the numbers were not accurate for Bolsonaro, but they were accurate for Lula. Lula got exactly what these institutes, all the institutes actually were predicting, but not Bolsonaro. Another surprise was the election of many senators in the states who are supporters of Bolsonaro. And in some cases, We were really surprised again because we saw, just to give you an example, the election in São Paulo of the senator from Bolsonaro. São Paulo is the largest state of Brazilian Federation. This person received 50% of the votes, but he appeared until a few weeks ago, again, 10 or 15 points behind the candidate who was the second in this race. And just the numbers were wrong, we think, because I don't believe that it's so, it's likely to have such a change in the very end of the election. Of course, we have some changes, but not in such a measure. And it was not only something that happened in São Paulo, but it repeated in many other states. And this is why among the 27 senators that were elected this year, 20 are Bolsonaro supporters. And it gives us an idea about how Bolsonaro, despite the fact of being the second in the presidential race, he was he won the elections yesterday. He was victorious in these elections. And besides that, again, the party of Bolsonaro, the Liberal Party, obtained the largest group in the House. Now we are talking about something like 15% of the seats in the House, what for Brazilian standards is a lot, since we have in Brazil a very fragmented political system, a very fragmented partisan system. And so this is really an impressive attainment. And besides that, other parties that are also supporters of Bolsonaro, at least now, they also obtained the majority of the House. And so if Lula wins, it will be quite difficult for him to govern in the next period.
Thank you very much, Claudio. So in order to unpack a little bit this fragmented political landscape, I think it would be useful to both talk a little bit about the landscape behind Bolsonaro and also, of course, the return of former President Lula and his political camp. So maybe we can start with the challenger, who is ultimately the winner of this round, former President Lula. I said that he made a return to the political scene. Maybe Juliana, would you be able to say a few words about where he is returning from and what's the political support behind him?
Hello, Renata. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with Thiago and Claudio. So I'm very happy to be here with you. So Lula is returning from being in jail after being condemned in a very rumorous case that was the car wash operation, and his charges and his sentences were all canceled, considered in the end void. But he's trying to overcome this narrative that was the majority narrative in last election, 2018, that in a way made possible to Bolsonaro be in power right now. As we know, Lula was a union leader during the dictatorship. He tried to become a president 3 times, actually becoming the president of the country in the 2000s. And he was re-elected and he left power with rates of approval higher than 80%. So he was an extremely popular president, and he left office in this position. He made Dilma Rousseff his successor. She was a president for 2 terms, but then we had this impeachment, considered by many an abusive impeachment that she suffered. And at that time, this narrative, this conception of his party, the Workers' Party, as a part of a corrupt system that led him to be condemned and to be in jail for more than a year. As I said, he was considered innocent in the end. He tried to run for president in 2018, but he was not allowed to because of these sentences. But finally, they were considered void, and now he's back with this big support. An interesting difference of this election is that Lula is trying to build this very broad alliance. So the vice president that is running with him is his former adversary, that is Geraldo Alckmin. that is right now together with him running as a vice president. So he's trying to build this broad coalition against Bolsonaro, and to a certain extent, he was successful in that, but maybe not as successful as some of us expected or hoped, or as some polls really showed just days before the election, as Claudio was saying.
Thank you so much, Juliana. So let me now turn to Thiago about President Bolsonaro. Where is he coming from politically, and what is the immediate agenda, or rather the immediate record of his presidency that he is running on in these elections?
So again, as everyone said, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a good moment after a terrible night. So let me, well, it's interesting because Bolsonaro is a contradiction in several ways. So he tries to play himself as outsider in the political system, although he's not. He was in the Congress for many mandates. He was not so much taken seriously when he was not a leader or anything of that sort. When he was in Congress, he was always far right with very explicit appraisals for the torture, dictatorship, and so on, killing of adversaries, of opponents, and things like this. So he was always ideologically far right in terms of especially in relation to military dictatorship and torture. He was always giving this sense of support for police, but in very strong terms, more from the far right perspective. And when he ran for election in 2018, he was actually right before 2018, he was increasing in terms of visibility and popularity within this context of manifestations against the Labour Party, against Dilma, in the context of impeachment. So in that moment, he managed to build up his career as a national leader. So ideologically, you can add to the far right military police discourse. You can also add this discourse of outsider, although he's not outsider. You can also add to his this puzzle of Bolsonaro. You can also add a conservative, religious conservative element, having the support of more conservative evangelicals, especially, and also the support of this military rhetoric that he always put forward. And finally, also you have to add, and this was essential for his victory in 2018, the support also for economic elite. So in 2018, for instance, Bolsonaro would win in the first round, and this time as well would win the first round if you take into consideration the richest people in Brazil. So Bolsonaro is a contradiction in several ways because he adds up several aspects to this puzzle. Religious conservative, a very strong far-right rhetoric in terms of policing and violence, and also this economic discourse. As far as his presidency went, he did very poorly, to say the least, in the pandemic. He was openly against the vaccinate mandate. He fought against actually the vaccination, and later on, especially in the latest speech at the UN recently, last month, he tried to say that he was kind of the father of the vaccination in Brazil, although it was not true. And also, he during his presidency, the socioeconomic terms, such as hunger in Brazil, increased. And he didn't want in the first time to provide social support in terms of social allowances for people during the pandemic, and later on he managed to say that this was his idea in the first place, but it wasn't. So his presidency was really very pro-gun rights. very against the vaccination and very much increasing his rhetoric against the institutions, especially the Supreme Court and the judiciary at large.
Thank you, Thiago. So let me now turn to an issue that was raised by Claudio, which is how the polls predicted Lula's numbers pretty well, but they absolutely under-forecasted Bolsonaro. And I mean, polling techniques aside, what would be the potential factors explaining the undercount? To what extent, for instance, would you think that the very violent rhetoric during the campaign, including physical violence and Bolsonaro's routine threats against journalists, against political opponents, would have featured in the undercount? So what are the factors that you think are most relevant in understanding the phenomenon, and why people wouldn't want to tell or reveal to pollsters that they support the sitting president? So Claudio first.
Well, I think that first of all, there is a methodological problem with many of these institutes, not necessarily because they use wrong tools in theory to make their polls, but because we have a problem of data. And the last census in Brazil happened about 12 years ago. This census is performing exactly now, and so certainly you have new data for the census only next year. And so many pollsters, they have to consider not exactly is the size of different sectors of the Brazilian population, considering race, considering class, considering not only gender is not so problematic because we have almost 50-50 with a minor majority for the women, but consider religion especially. And since the evangelicals are strong voters, strong supporters of Bolsonaro and of conservative politicians in general, we don't know exactly what's the size of the evangelical population now in Brazil. Some people estimate 25%, others estimate 30%, but perhaps we have even more than this. And Brazil has a very impressive religious transition in recent years. Actually, when I say recent years, I mean recent decades. In the early 70s, evangelicals represented only 5% of the population. Today, perhaps they are 35%, and they vote more intensively in conservative or even far-right candidates. What's the weight of this sector of the electorate? We don't know exactly. A second point that has to do with this is perhaps some people are hypothesizing about this because we don't know yet what are the correct answers for this problem, but that many of the hidden votes, they come perhaps from women. When you consider women and their electoral preferences, women in general, Brazil, they prefer Lula in a larger measure to Bolsonaro. We're talking something like 50-30, accordingly to many of the pollsters. But we are not sure if this was the final result. What some analysts are considering is that perhaps many women that declare to not vote to Bolsonaro, actually they voted for Bolsonaro in the very end. And so this is why we have such a surprise. But even this question, I don't think that is properly answered with this attempt, considering only the female vote, because we have also all these problems concerning the results in the states, concerning elections for Senate, elections for governors. It's not only a problem of presidential election, it's a much more widespread problem of obtaining the correct data. And this is why I think that we have problems in terms of methodological tools, not, again, what are theoretically the tools, but how these tools are dealing with the available data. And this is probably why we have this.
Well, thank you very much, Claudio. Now let me pick up on the women's voters, the women voter and sexual minorities and the gender dimension to the divisiveness of recent Brazilian politics. Juliana, how do you see the gender map behind this somewhat surprising result?
Yes, as Claudio said, the polls all show that women were much more pro-Lula than men, also the same with evangelical, but the result puts that in question, probably. But that's surprising because Bolsonaro has always had a very strong rhetoric against women. And this was very clear until the end. One of the last debates, there was a very serious attack on a journalist, a female journalist that presented him a question, and that affected apparently negatively his performance in that specific debate. Was not the last one, but that seemed to be important at that point. And the reaction of the people interviewed showed that yes, it caused a bad impression, but in the end, it didn't prevent him from having these result. We don't know how he'll behave from now on, because he seemed much more controlled regarding this topic in the very end, this last week. Probably he was oriented to do so because of his very bad performance against women. But there is also a risk that in these final weeks, he become again more radicalized. He resurrects the very strong rhetoric he has been used against women, or pro a certain kind of women or a certain kind of gender role. And he has been helped by his wife, that in the beginning was a little bit reluctant in joining the campaign more clearly, but also in the end became very visible, very vocal, and making very very strongly religiously speeches in favor of him, and also picturing him as a husband that makes his mistakes but should be forgiven, and using this frame of a, so to speak, traditional family as a metaphor for his performance as a president.
May I just say one thing on gender?
Sure.
Just quickly, I think that I agree with what Juliana was saying. I would add just a few points. One is it stressed the last point about the participation of Michelle Bolsonaro, the wife of Bolsonaro, because he was really playing the card of putting her in and using her in the election campaigns, because this will target both women and evangelicals. And women reject Bolsonaro more, according to the polls, and including among evangelicals, but to a lesser extent. So his strategy of using Michelle Bolsonaro was smart in the way that, in a way, to break this resistance. And I think also we had one other thing that Bolsonaro was doing, although he did a political violence among many in the national debate against a journalist, women journalists. He was also saying that he was the one who approved a lot of laws for women and things like this. So he was trying to change his record as well to mention the what he thinks was good initiatives for women, and I think that I'm not sure, and I had to think about it because it's very recent, but I'm not sure whether Bolsonaro would go for more radical rhetoric. What we saw his interview after the election yesterday was actually a very moderate Bolsonaro. He was very much saying that, well, now we had to talk with people and so on, because I think that he doesn't win anything by going more extreme than he already has gone because he already has 40+% of the electorate. So I think what he and Lula were trying to do is to sound as moderate as they can and tackle saying that the opponent is more dangerous in order to win the indecisive, or actually to trying to switch the vote for the third candidate, and not actually trying to play the strong man as he was doing so far, because this election, people already had the preferences very early on. So basically, this first round sounds much like a second round in the Brazilian context.
So let me then see what you expect next, because this is where the conversation is going. Claudio said in the beginning that the real winner of the first round is actually Bolsonaro and not Lula, despite the fact that Lula came out on top. So what kind of reserves in terms of rhetorical and policy and also political support reserves does Lula have, and what is it that Bolsonaro can mobilize? I'm asking this against the background of there is plenty of unspent votes, so there are still voters who were inactive in this round. How would a higher turnout in the second round affect the chances of the two remaining candidates? So what do you see next before the second round? I go first to Claudio.
Okay, I just want to stress that the difference between Lula and Bolsonaro was considerable in this first round. We're talking about 5 points, 5% in favor of Lula. And it means 5 million votes, roughly 5 million votes. And Lula was just 1.6% of winning in the first round. It means that if Lula has less than 2 million votes added to the votes that he already obtained in the first round in the runoff, well, it's enough for him to win. Bolsonaro must receive even more. He must receive 7 million votes, or 7% of the valid votes in the runoff. And so I don't think in this regard it's so difficult to Lula to obtain a victory, to be the winner in the second round. But on the other hand, what kind of support Bolsonaro has? Well, I started here presenting the results in terms of the size of the parties in the Congress, that Bolsonaro won in many states the elections for senator, with his supporters obtaining the seats. He also elected governors in important states like Rio de Janeiro, for example. He has a candidate in São Paulo that is the largest state in terms of voters and population, that finished the first round as the first in the race. This is also very significant. He certainly will obtain the support of the elected governor, re-elected actually in the first round, governor of the state of Minas Gerais. That is the second largest state in the country, and that will certainly be a supporter of Bolsonaro in the second round. So he has considerable support from what we could call the traditional political class. Even more, of course, the right-wing political class in Brazil. That can mean two different things. On one hand, we can talk about ideological sectors of this political class that are the truly supporters of Bolsonaro, that are really or ultra-conservative or even far-rightists. These people will be certainly working hard for him in this runoff. Besides that, we have also a sector of the traditional political class in Brazil that are not so clearly ideological, but they are very pragmatic, and they are in different administrations of different parties supporters of the government. It doesn't mean with government, it means that is a government. And so if there is a government, they'll be in favor of it if they obtain something in exchange. This is how these people work. And now they are government. They are with Bolsonaro, and probably they will remain with Bolsonaro in the second round. Oh, in such a case, of course, it's easy for him to obtain more votes, perhaps to be very close to Lula in the end of this 4 weeks until the second round. Well, this is the support in the political class, but there is another important support in the entrepreneurial class. When you consider the finance people, the people from even some sectors, from the salesman, from even some sectors of industry that are clear supporters of Bolsonaro. A very clear difference between the interests of voters in voting for Bolsonaro or Lula was during this first round of the election correlated with income, with the wealth of people. And the wealthiest, they vote much more for Bolsonaro. The more wealthiest they were, the more they voted for Bolsonaro. And certainly, Bolsonaro will again obtain support from business people. I think this will be quite important for him again. And finally, he has the support of armored sectors. When I say armored sectors, I mean three different things: the armed forces, and so the army, the navy, and the air force. I mean the state police, mostly the military state police, where Bolsonaro has considerable support among everyone almost, and finally among civilians who raise arms, who bear arms. These guys received the allowance of Bolsonaro to buy more guns, to buy more ammunition. There was a multiplication of clubs of shooting, and in these cases we have also important supporters of Bolsonaro. And so there is also this threat of real violence, not only symbolic violence, to be used during the campaign against oppositors. And this is why I think that Bolsonaro will be a very difficult oppositor to Lula during this runoff.
Thank you, Claudio. Now this takes me, of course, to asking about the threats of a coup potentially arranged by businessmen on a WhatsApp chat, and the judicial intervention on account of this coup. Thiago, would you give a sense of how important judicial intervention was, and how important the role of the judiciary, and especially the newly appointed Supreme Election Judge Alexandre de Moraes is in the context of an upcoming second round?
So Brazilian is just, in order to understand elections, we had to understand the institutional framework of Brazil. And one thing that is very interesting when you look from the angle of the judiciary is that the elections are overseen by electoral justice, and this electoral justice at the highest level, so the High Court of Justice in the elections is basically composed. Part of it is composed by the ministers, by the justice of Supreme Court. So there is the intersection between the justice of Supreme Court and the judges in the electoral system, because the idea was actually to have an independent body overseeing the election. And one of the things that Bolsonaro did throughout his presidency, and especially during the elections, is basically casting doubt on the electoral system, which is electronic, and on the basis of misinformation and fake news. And also attacking specifically justice from the Supreme Court, and also the same justice from the electoral system, electoral justice system. And this was a very good strategy from Bolsonaro, although they were totally based on misinformation and fake news. It was a very good strategy in order to find an enemy, to find someone who we should target. And Bolsonaro also suffered several losses before the Supreme Court round during his presidency. So he has a lot of interest in actually taking over the Supreme Court. But it's very hard in the Brazilian context, but how he could do it. And so first, one thing that he's trying to do during his presidency, and especially the election, is tackling the impartiality of the electoral justice system. Also, he is tackling decisions by the Alexandre de Moraes, who is a justice from the Supreme Court, and also the head of the electoral justice court, the highest court. He's targeting him because basically he's saying that he's got giving a lot of decisions against fake news, misinformation, against businessmen supporting Bolsonaro, dismantling the networks of communication of spread of fake news. So Bolsonaro is really angry at the Supreme Court for doing that. And so what he can do? So first he appointed people who are more aligned with Bolsonaro. So he managed to appoint 2 justices to the Supreme Court. If he wins, he will appoint more 2 justices to the Supreme Court. There's a plan also, and this sounds like other countries, Hungary and other places. He wants to expand also. There's a proposal to expand maybe the number of justices in the Supreme Court. So this would give more room for control. And also in the Brazilian context, it's interesting that the Supreme Court does not decide everything in the plenary session. So, which means that the individual justice, they have a lot of power individually in order to maybe postpone the decision of a case or to decide individually a specific case. So even if Bolsonaro does not manage to have a more justice to have the majority of Supreme Court, which is unlikely in the next if he wins the election. By appointing more justice and by continuing his attack on the Supreme Court, he'll manage to get more control of it. So I think that in relation to the judiciary, the president, from the judiciary came the main resistance against institutional resistance against Bolsonaro. So we had to see whether he'll manage to go against and control the Supreme Court in some shape or form. But really, the Supreme Court is one of the key talking points in the election from the Bolsonaro angle.
Well, thank you very much, Thiago. So we saw so far potential reserves for mobilization. We also saw the demonization of the judiciary and the very important source of constitutional resistance. Now, let me go to Juliana, because it's very, at least from an external perspective, it seems that demonizing large clusters of voters, threatening with violence, threatening with a coup, could actually intimidate key voters who would otherwise cast votes for former President Lula. Juliana, would you be able to talk a little bit about the threat tactics and their patterns, especially before the second round?
Sure. Political violence was a major concern during this electoral process. It's true that political violence in a way always existed in Brazil, but prior to these elections, it was more visibly directed to candidates. And now we saw a lot of political violence among supporters and voters and all that. In fact, we had an investigation a week before the first round yesterday that showed that 7% of the population were afraid of suffering some kind of violence when voting. So it's very high numbers. But in fact, apparently, as we know by now, this was not reflected in the absentees. So people apparently didn't get intimidated in the end to go voting, but there is this atmosphere, and these threats can play a major role in the second turn. And something that seems contradictory, that I think maybe it's important to highlight, that despite these threats and the actual violence, including deaths that we saw in the past weeks, it's interesting to see how Lula supporters and the left in general were occupying the streets with its colors more unabashedly than in 2018. I think that has to do with this recuperation of narrative related to Lula's and the PT and all that. But it's interesting to see this contradiction, because despite the violence, there are new forms of vocalizing the claims of the left. And also, I think it's also important to flag that certain sectors, like extremely marginalized sectors, for instance, trans persons, for the first time became represented in the federal legislative. So we have now 2 trans representatives in the Chamber of Representatives. So this is something important and in a way contradictory regarding the other results that we have seen, especially the fact that the most unashamed supporters of Bolsonaro, the ones that were part of his government, were awarded by being elected to Senate and House of Representatives, as, for instance, his former Minister of Environment, Health, and Human Rights. So they were all elected, or many of them were elected, but at the same time, we had this other side of, for instance, trans persons being elected to the Federal Chamber of Representatives.
So let me ask a last question about the regional and international political dynamics around the 2 candidates. The last panel we had on Brazil traced President Bolsonaro's trip to Moscow and to Budapest. It's very clear that there is a great affinity between the current Hungarian government, both between the prime minister and also the presidential visit and Brazil. Size doesn't seem to matter as much as the intellectual and ideological connections between illiberal populist governments, the recent election of Giorgia Meloni in Italy is definitely also boosting this alliance. On the regional level, it seems that as if Lula and the left had made major advances in recent elections. So as a last round of comments from each one of you, could you give a hint on how do you see these international connections and their relevance for boosting electoral support before the second round?
Well,
Go, Claudio.
I go, you go. I go? I was just
You can
following
go first.
the initial order, sorry. Well, I think that Bolsonaro became a very important actor in this far-right alliance around the world. And I say alliance because there is actually an alliance. We can talk about a network of far-right leaders around the world in different countries, in Europe, in Latin America, in North America. And why he became so important? Because he is the president of a very large democracy. And so the geopolitical importance of Brazil, not only in the region, but in the Southern Hemisphere, represents an important asset for this far-rightist movement. This is why, for example, a guy like Steve Bannon is so concerned with Brazilian elections. And this is why when Bolsonaro goes abroad, well, he has as his most receptive political leaders, not leaders from liberal democracies or full liberal democracies, but leaders of either the far-right parties in liberal democracies, like the case of Italy, where he has important connections with the now incumbent government in Italy, but also in illiberal democracies, like the case of Hungary or even Poland, or the case of in Russia. I don't think that we can talk even about democracy, either even if it is illiberal, but an authoritarian regime. And so Bolsonaro is a representative of them, and he's a strong representative of them. He runs an important economy, a large country, a huge population, and he is very well connected with all the sectors of the far right. And so a victor of Bolsonaro in Brazil will be a victor for this sector, even more after the far right candidates were defeated in some countries in Latin America recently, like in Colombia or Chile, or even Argentina, where they tried to obtain a position in last elections, but they failed. And so this is why it's so important for Bolsonaro now. And certainly, of course, I was forgetting that, considering the defeat of Trump recently in the United States. So it will be a real asset for them to have this victory here.
Thiago?
I think I'll just add one thing that is very interesting in this election was to prove also Claudio's point about Bolsonaro being this representative of this right in globally. During the last week of the election, there was a series of videos sent out by far-right populist leaders in support of Bolsonaro. So Orban recorded a video, Trump recorded a video, Trump Jr. recorded a video, Cast from Chile recorded a video, Javier Milei from Argentina recorded a video, the leader of the Vox political party in Spain recorded a video. So it shows that Bolsonaro really is seen as one of the leaders in this far right, for the reasons Claudio already mentioned. It's a big country. He's running for election. He's not as weakened as people would think he would be by this point. And before the election yesterday, the first round of election yesterday, people thought that the Bolsonarism as a political movement, as a far-right political movement, would survive probably Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro as a leader would dismantle somehow. But that's actually not what happened. So I think the reality is that globally, Bolsonaro himself is still a leader of one of the leaders of this far-right movement globally, and his political movement is also quite strong when you look at the numbers. But I think also which shows that even if he loses, there is a strong basis. If he managed to keep the strong basis, then he will likely keep it because of the people he elected for the Congress and the governors. He might be able to, or his family be able to, still in power in the near future. And I think that globally, another strategy that Bolsonaro did was to try to sell to international community that the elections were subject or were likely to be fraud. So he did this infamous meeting with several investors in Brasilia, presenting what he thought was the proof that the election was not clean. And this actually, people did receive it as a skepticism. So I think that he doesn't have the support of a large, he's not respected at all by a larger international community, but he is really building up his place international arena as one of those leaders, and the series of videos that he received in the last election show that clearly. Lula also got support globally from different leaders, more from the center, for the left, but it's very clear that Bolsonaro also has a place in this arena.
Juliana, let me give a particular edge to the international relations question from reproductive rights and especially access to abortion, because in the Americas in recent months we have seen an extremely important movement towards opening up access to safe and legal abortions. This is definitely the international context for Lula's efforts and for generally understood to belong with the pink tide, and the absolute counterpoint to the illiberal international that is emphasizing traditional family values and trying to put shackles on women's rights. So how do you see the embeddedness of these campaigns, and are they using these resources, these rhetorical resources at all in the second half of the campaign? Juliana.
Yes, I think this is an important part of the campaign, and probably will be even more in this next month. But I think we are in a tricky position. We have witnessed like these huge setbacks regarding abortion in Brazil. Even if the region goes in another trend, Bolsonaro government has restricted access to legal abortion. The abortion that is already recognized by legislation and case law. His Ministry of Health has imposed new barriers to people acceding it, and we had very notorious cases of pregnant children that were not allowed to have access to an abortion procedure. But I have doubts if and to what extent Lula will be able to engage in a pro-abortion agenda at this point. I think probably in the campaign, he had mentioned the issue in a favorable way during the campaign, and he got like bad reactions because of that, saying he was pro-abortion. And then he said he understands it's public health issues, but he was not very clear about that. And recently, the vice president, the candidate Geraldo Alckmin, said he's not pro-abortion, as Lula is not. So Lula didn't say it directly, but his vice president said that. So I think we are in a complicated position, because even if we have a left or center-left government with Lula, it's not clear how we'll be able to advance. Also considering what Claudio mentioned in the very beginning, parliament will be taken by conservative and far-right forces. So it will be hard. It will be probably a government of compromises. And unfortunately, when these compromises come, the bargain passes by leaving the gender and LGBTQ rights aside. So usually they are the first ones that were thrown away. And I don't have to believe why that would be different. Of course, I should notice that Workers' Party, it's a party that has sections of it that are very vocally pro-abortion, but I don't see how they will prevail in next years, at least with this. I don't want to be pessimistic, but seeing the scenario and the difficulties and the resistance regarding this topic specifically, I find it very hard for Brazil to follow the Latin American liberalization trend. Some years ago, there was certain expectation regarding the Supreme Court. We have an action that is still pending before the court for the decriminalization of abortion. And the rapporteur, the justice that is in charge, is a female justice, is Justice Rosa Weber, that is the current president of the Supreme Court. When she became the president, she was supposed to leave her processes behind, but she took a few of them with her for her to decide during her presidency, and one of them was these abortion cases. So we can have an expectation that before she retires next year, she maybe cast her vote on this case. Probably the case will be interrupted by other justices, but this could be an interesting development on the topic in Brazil. But I think that more than that is difficult to foresee right now, unfortunately, of course.
Well, I would like to thank all three of you for this extremely challenging tour de force of looking at all the issues, the past, the present, and the near future of Brazilian elections before we go into a second round, which is going to be a face-off between ex-President Lula and current President Bolsonaro. We definitely will be back after the second round for a follow-up on the implications of whatever the result is going to bring for democracy in Brazil, in the Americas, and more globally. Enormous thanks are to Cláudio Couto, Juliana, Cesario, and Thiago Amparo for your time today. I would also like to thank the managing editor of Revdem, Michal Matlak, for supporting the panel, and for Hannah Voss for her assistance. Last but not least, Robert Nebent for masterfully managing our social media. Do stay with RevDem and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Our next public panel, which is a similar Blitz panel, will be a follow-up on the Italian elections. Please join us. We look forward to hearing from you. A lovely rest of the day to all of you in the Americas, and I see you soon in person, Juliana.